We all want the very best GPU on the market, the top tier cards that smash every benchmark and run games at ludicrous frame rates. But realistically, for most gamers out there, that's just not where the focus needs to be. A lot of you need to put your focus on the more mainstream end of the market, where performance, features, and crucially price all need to balance out. Well, that's exactly why today is all about a head-to-head battle in that sweet spot of the graphics card market. We've got AMD's brand new Radeon RX 9060 XT squaring off against NVIDIA's fresh out the box GeForce RTX 5060. Now, the 9060 XT rocks up with a hefty 16GB of VRAM, which on paper should give it a decent edge, especially as, well, games get more demanding and chew through memory like there's no tomorrow. But, and this is a crucial part, that extra VRAM and potentially better specs come with a higher price tag than the RTX 5060. So the burning question we're here to answer today is, well, pretty simple. Does that extra cost for the AMD card actually translate into enough of a performance lead to make it worth your hard-earned cash? Or will the RTX 5060, possibly coming in at a more attractive price point, deliver the same or even better gaming performance, proving that you don't always need more VRAM to win? Well, that's what we're going to find out. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor.
Alright, stay calm. You've got one job. Do not let this thing overheat.
It's running hot. How do I know if it's safe?
Get the WireView Pro.
The WireView Pro safeguards your graphics card with real-time power and temperature monitoring, acoustic alarms for custom thresholds, and sensor pin detection to ensure proper 12V PWR connection. External sensors can monitor additional components like memory or voltage regulators, while an OLED display provides instant insights, meaning that this is the last time you'll blow a 12V PWR connector, soldier. To keep your system protected, click the link in the description below.
So as always, I'm not going to sit here and kind of bore you by running over all of the specs in detail. With any of these head-to-heads where we're comparing an AMD card against an NVIDIA card, going spec for spec doesn't really do either of them any justice because, well, they're both engineered in very different ways under the hood. Like we said in the intro, while everyone wants the absolute best, these two cards are squarely aimed at that crucial mainstream segment. Now, the Radeon RX 9060 XT with 16GB of VRAM currently hits the market at $349, while the GeForce RTX 5060 comes in at $299, so a 17% disparity in price. So again, that big question, as always, comes down to if that extra cost for the AMD card truly translates into a performance advantage, and if so, by how much to warrant that extra price difference. To find out, we've thrown both cards at 30 different games across 3 different resolutions to get a complete picture of which one performs the best, and we'll take a look at around 10 here today before going into the percentage differences. Now, to put these cards through their paces, we ran them on our dedicated GPU test bench, powered by an AMD Ryzen 7 9800X3D, sitting on a Gigabyte B650E Aorus Master motherboard, paired with 32GB of Corsair Vengeance RGB, 6000MHz CL30 dual-channel memory. All of our testing was done on Windows 11 with the latest updates supplied and with the latest BIOS revision for the motherboard. In terms of the drivers, we used NVIDIA's 576.52 driver and AMD's 25.10.09.01 press driver. Even though we tested at all 3 resolutions, our main focus is going to be on 1080p and 1440p, as this is where these cards are actually aimed at. Though it's always nice to get a full picture, as depending on the game, 4K may be possible at reasonable frame rates. Also, if you want to check out all of the detailed charts for all of the games, they'll be available exclusively to our Patreon supporters, where you'll also get access to a ton of other cool exclusive benefits too. The link for that, as always, is down below. So, with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. Starting things off with a Plague Tale Requiem, where at 1080p we see AMD ahead of NVIDIA by a decent 19% on average. But this gap does increase massively as we move up to 1440p, as the 9060 XT now comes in 39% faster than the RTX 5060. Then at 4K, the margin does shrink back down, now at 12%, still in favour of AMD, showing that the extra cost involved does make a tangible difference in this title. Moving over to Alan Wake 2, the lead that AMD has continues with 25% faster performance at 1080p over the NVIDIA counterpart, which is interesting because, well, this game is technically classed as an NVIDIA title. Again, increasing the resolution to 1440p, we do still see a strong lead of 24% over NVIDIA, and then at 4K, unlike in the last game, the lead stays steady with the 9060 XT coming in with 25% more frames, much like we saw at 1080. When we enable ray tracing and enable upscaling, as the game is so demanding, the lead continues, but the gap narrows drastically, with just a 4% variance at both 1080 and 1440p, while 4K really shows that 8GB of VRAM isn't cutting it anymore, as even with upscaling enabled, NVIDIA come in with their worst result at just 4 FPS, which puts AMD ahead by a staggering 550%. Though even at 26 FPS, you'll want to drop your quality settings down to boost that number up to, well, something more playable. When running Baldur's Gate 3, both cards came in much closer in terms of performance, with AMD still leading, but at a much smaller margin of just 6% at 1080p, 10% at 1440p, and 9 identical results at 4K, separated by just a single FPS in favour to the red team. Black Myth Wukong with ray tracing turned on and set to medium allowed NVIDIA to shine at all three resolutions. At 1080, the RDNA 4 base card now sits 36% behind the RTX 5060, a larger 38% slower at 1440, and at 4K, while the gap looks to have narrowed dramatically, separated by just 3 frames per second, due to the performance being so low, as expected at the higher resolution, this now means that AMD ends up sitting 30% behind the new Blackwell base card. Counter-Strike 2's huge frame rate showed both cards in a good light, but the win at 1080p still gets handed to AMD, which comes in 6% faster. But more interestingly is the 1% low figures, where NVIDIA suffers pretty badly, falling behind by quite a large margin. While 1440p sees things improve for NVIDIA in the averages, essentially matching the performance of the 9060 XT, the 1% lows still suffer badly. Then at 4K, AMD now falls 15% behind NVIDIA, but still manages to come in much stronger in the dips, leading to a better overall gaming experience. Things get back on track in Cyberpunk, where the 9060 XT leads at 1080p by 43%, while that gap shrinks at 1440p and 4K to 16% and 26% respectively. As these cards are aimed squarely at 1080p and 1440p gaming, this is another title where AMD takes the crown, and at 4K, no matter the card, upscaling of some kind is going to be needed. Enabling ray tracing, we see performance on both cards take a hit, though at 1080p, both scenarios are still playable when looking at the averages, though NVIDIA suffer yet again in those all-important lows, which sit 66% lower. As we move up in resolution, we're now in the realms of being unplayable without upscaling, though again, AMD hold the lead and NVIDIA again struggle in those all-important lows. Now, Indiana Jones is an important one, as it's worth noting that to get the game to run at 1440p or higher on the NVIDIA card, the texture pool size had to be reduced to medium. Otherwise, the game would simply crash. So the data isn't an exact apples-to-apples comparison. That aside, AMD still take the win by 34% at 1080p, and the lows tell an even worse story for NVIDIA, as AMD lead there by a whopping 72%. As we move up to 1440p, the gap narrows, with AMD now holding a 23% lead over the green team, and the 1% low figures have fixed themselves, likely due to the texture pool size. And then at 4K, NVIDIA now take the lead, though due to the fix in place to get it running, it's a bit of a hollow victory, as you could claim that NVIDIA on the same settings actually rendered a 0, or just a did not finish. In Starfield, which is arguably an AMD-based game, the RDNA 4 card again comes out on top at all three resolutions, with an 18% lead at 1080p, 19% more frames at 1440p, and the same 19% faster performance at 4K, again showing its superiority. Also, something of note is the fact that the lows on the 9060 XT were always equal or better than the averages of the 5060 at all three resolutions. So with the 10 games done, I think it's pretty clear to see the general trend from this head-to-head. While NVIDIA's RTX 5060 certainly held its own and even took a dominant lead in titles like Black Myth Wukong, the AMD Radeon RX 9060 XT really showed strong performance across a significant portion of our tests. It consistently delivered higher average frame rates and, perhaps more critically, better 1% lows in many instances. That 16GB of VRAM seems to be making a tangible difference, particularly as resolutions climbed and texture demands increased in some of those games. What's particularly interesting to note, especially given typical expectations, is how the 9060 XT performed even when ray tracing was enabled. Games like Alan Wake 2 and Cyberpunk are often considered NVIDIA favoured when it comes to ray tracing, yet AMD's latest RDNA 4 architecture showed some significant refinements. While the performance hit from ray tracing was evident on both cards, the 9060 XT still managed to hold its own and even maintain a lead in some cases, indicating that AMD has made notable strides in that area. Now, the 17% price disparity, with the 9060 XT coming in at $349 compared to the $299 of the 5060, is obviously something to consider. However, based purely on the raw performance we saw in this selection of games, especially at 1080 and 1440, where these cards are primarily targeted, that extra investment often did translate into a noticeable boost in performance, and in some cases, a smoother experience. The 9060 XT's lows, as seen in Starfield, often kept pace with or even surpassed the 5060's averages, and that's a pretty big selling point, though we've seen these 1% low issues on other NVIDIA 50 series cards, and thankfully, driver updates have seen it improve. Now, to get a better picture as to what this means in a bigger selection of games, it's worth taking a look at the percentage differences across all 30 games. It's here where at 1080p there's a very clear winner, with the RX 9060 XT, as, well, it comes in 28% faster overall. There are some outliers, including Doom Eternal with ray tracing enabled, where the RDNA 4 base card comes in with a, well, laughable 187% more frames. And this is where the cracks start to show in the new Blackwell card, as even at 1080p, the 8GB of VRAM just shows that it's not up to the task. Beyond that, things do die down somewhat, and NVIDIA also takes some wins, with the biggest coming by the way of Black Myth Wukong with ray tracing enabled, with the AMD card coming in 36% slower. The other big win for the green team is in Dying Light 2, again, another title with ray tracing enabled, so I guess if we omit RT results, AMD would still win overall, but by a slightly different margin. Now, as we look at the 1% lows, there is a bit of a theme with these new NVIDIA cards, as the 9060 XT comes in 51% faster overall, again with the Doom Eternal ray traced result sending the biggest message, coming in 390% faster. Even without that result, Cyberpunk coming in 191% faster on the AMD card doesn't look great for NVIDIA, even if they do, again, win by some margin in Black Myth Wukong and Dying Light 2 yet again. Now, as we move up to 1440p, it's even worse for the Blackwell-based GPU, as now the 9060 XT comes in a pretty staggering 50% faster, with very much the same outliers like Doom Eternal with a 340% disparity, and this time Hogwarts Legacy with RT enabled at 227% faster on the newest RDNA 4 card. The usual suspects help bring things back in line for NVIDIA with Dying Light 2 and Black Myth Wukong, both with RT enabled, showing some strength for the green team, but at a 50% difference for arguably what is not much more money, it's a pretty stark set of results that make AMD's latest card look, frankly, amazing. Again, looking at the 1% lows, it's even worse for NVIDIA, as AMD sits 82% ahead overall, again with some big differences in Hogwarts Legacy and Doom Eternal ray traced yet again. And as to no surprise, well, NVIDIA do take some wins, but it's not enough to pull away from the fact that NVIDIA do suffer dramatically in those lows, and some driver work, well, definitely needs to be addressed. Though neither of these cards are aimed at it, I did want to take a look at the 4K data, and, well, for laughs, I thought I'd show you, as the 9060 XT comes in 169% faster overall when looking at the averages. To be fair, this is predominantly because of the astronomical 1800% faster result in Hogwarts Legacy with ray tracing enabled. Though even if this was taken out, the RX 9060 XT would still come in 112% faster overall. So while one game is a massive outlier, it then falls down onto Control at 1050%, Alan Wake 2 at 550%, and, well, so on. Now, when it comes to both of these GPUs, as they are aimed at the more, let's say, budget-conscious end of the market, not everyone has a huge wattage power supply to deal with delivering power directly to them, and power is definitely going to be a contributing factor when looking at buying one of them. As we look at 27 games, as not all games tested give us power data, we can see that NVIDIA is the clear winner, with the AMD card consistently pulling more power. Though, to play devil's advocate, we did use the Nitro Plus model, which has a higher power limit, and a more, let's say, reference spec card would use around 20 watts less power in all games. Now, the biggest difference is seen in Doom Eternal with RT enabled, which is arguably the game that AMD saw the biggest wins in, though some other games of note would be Remnant 2, where AMD used just under 100 watts more power. And the smallest differences were from A Plague Tale and Alan Wake 2, which saw a difference of around 38 watts. 1440p saw the results shift a little, though it's still very clear that AMD uses a lot more power on average, with again Doom Eternal giving us the biggest variance and Alan Wake 2 with the smallest difference in power. Though our AMD card consistently hits its power limits, begging the question of if it could actually perform even better if it had even more headroom at its disposal. Now, when it comes to temperatures, these generally go kind of hand in hand with power consumption. But what we saw here was NVIDIA, for the most part, actually seeing higher temperatures, peaking at 61 degrees in both a Plague Tale and Alan Wake 2 yet again. While AMD's lowest temperatures at 1080p came by the way of Black Myth Wukong with RT enabled, and Cyberpunk at 51 degrees. Though it is worth noting that NVIDIA did come in the cooler card on occasion, like in Doom Eternal with RT enabled, yet again. Then, as we move up to 1440p, things drew closer, but AMD still takes the win yet again. Though there were, I guess, some closer results, like in Hogwarts Legacy with RT enabled, though games like Alan Wake 2 saw much bigger differences in heat to the tune of around 14 degrees. Though, I guess, again, devil's advocate, both cards kept things under control and well within reasonable levels. So, I think it's pretty clear to see that for most gamers looking in the mainstream segment of the market, AMD has delivered a seriously compelling package with the RX 9060 XT. Across our extensive 30-game test suite, particularly at 1080 and 1440p where these cards are aimed, the 9060 XT consistently pulled ahead of the cheaper RTX 5060. The overall percentage lead at 1080p and the even larger gap at 1440p, where the AMD card was, frankly, quite a lot faster, speaks volumes about its raw performance capabilities. The 16GB of VRAM clearly plays a critical role here, especially in those more, let's say, demanding titles and at higher resolutions, preventing the major VRAM bottlenecks that we saw impact the RTX 5060. What's also hugely important is how AMD's RDNA 4 architecture has matured in ray tracing performance. While NVIDIA still holds some wins, particularly in games like Black Myth Wukong and Dying Light 2 with RT enabled, the 9060 XT made significant strides. The massive lead in titles like Doom Eternal and Hogwarts Legacy with ray tracing on highlights that AMD is closing the gap, and in some cases, blowing past NVIDIA when memory becomes a limiting factor. Now, the issues with NVIDIA's 1% lows, which is, I guess, a recurring theme, we've seen on other 50 series cards. And, well, that definitely impacted the overall smoothness of the RTX 5060's experience. And this is something AMD just, well, didn't seem to suffer from as much. Now, on the flip side, when it comes to power consumption and thermals, the 5060 generally proved to be the more efficient card, consistently drawing less power than the RX 9060 XT. While our Nitro Plus model naturally pushes its power limits, even a reference AMD card would still typically draw more power. However, it's a trade-off. AMD is using that extra wattage to push significantly higher performance, especially where VRAM again becomes that all-important critical factor. Ultimately, both cards stayed within very reasonable thermal limits, so it doesn't necessarily impact daily usability, but it's certainly, I guess, worth noting if that's of importance to you. So, considering the $349 price tag of the RX 9060 XT against the $299 RTX 5060, a 17% price difference, the performance uplift delivered by the AMD card, coupled with its significantly larger VRAM buffer and improved ray tracing capabilities, means that the 9060 XT offers a very compelling proposition in terms of value. For the extra $50, you are getting a card that in many scenarios delivers a substantially better and more consistent gaming experience, particularly as games continue to push the boundaries of VRAM usage. And, well, this is where you have a clear choice, as the next card up in the stack, on the NVIDIA side, is more expensive yet again. Well, that's going to wrap this up on this head-to-head. Speaking of the more expensive card, we will actually be pitting the 9060 XT against the 5060 Ti 16GB soon, so make sure you're subscribed for that, because that should be an interesting one, considering that the NVIDIA card actually comes in $70 more expensive than the AMD card. So it'll be good to see how the two cards compare, considering that we won't be limited on the NVIDIA GPU by VRAM issues, as both cards come packing 16GB of memory. For now, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, a like and a subscribe to the channel would be amazing. Also, if you love what we do and want to see the rest of the charts for all of the games, then you can by joining the super special Patreon club. You also get access to a ton of other cool goodies, including behind-the-scenes content, bi-weekly game nights, and much, much more. The link for all that good stuff is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.